This is the first of two World Sociology screencasts examining the role of transnational organisations. So in this screencast we're going to begin by defining transnational organisations, and then we're going to look at some of the main types of transnational organisations that have an influence on developing countries. And then we're going to spend a bit of time looking specifically at the role of the Bretton Woods institutions. And then in the second screencast on this topic, we'll focus our attention specifically on the role of transnational corporations, or TNC is normally the abbreviation that is used. So this term transnational organisations refers to international organisations that exist above the level of the nation state and that in a sense transcend national boundaries. And there are some other terms that you might come across that refer to the same types of organisations. So sometimes transnational organisations are called supranational organisations or multinational organisations. And so the key idea is that transnational organisations have a remit that goes beyond a single country. And it was the 20th century that saw a real growth in the number of transnational organisations, particularly following the end of World War II. So on the one hand, we've got transnational organisations that involve different governments working together, and that obviously includes the United Nations, and in our region of the world, the European Union. We've also got the Bretton Woods institutions that have an important role to play in managing the global economy, and then we've got organisations that really are agencies of the United Nations that have a specific policy focus, such as the World Health Organization. And then on the other hand, we have non-governmental organisations, so organisations that are independent of a particular government, and that includes charitable organisations. So we've got big international charities like Oxfam. We've got international pressure groups that might have an interest in development issues, such as Amnesty International, and we've of course got the International Committee of the Red Cross. And then another type of really important transnational NGO are of course the transnational corporations, which we'll focus on in more detail in the second screencast on this particular topic area. Right, I want to spend the rest of this screencast looking at the role of the Bretton Woods institutions in more detail. And the Bretton Woods institutions consist of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Let's start with the World Bank. The World Bank was set up at the end of World War II, and its initial focus was on the reconstruction of Europe, but over time the World Bank's main focus has been on developing countries. So its mission has been to promote economic development and poverty reduction in developing countries. The IMF oversees the management of the global economy and tries to ensure that economic turbulence in one country doesn't disturb others. And in practice this means that the IMF is the lender of last resort. So if a government can't borrow money from other sources and it needs a bailout, then it will go to the IMF. And then the World Trade Organization acts as a negotiating forum for the promotion of free trade. So the role of the WTO is to negotiate trade agreements to remove trade barriers between different countries and regions of the world. Now there would seem to be some pretty sensible arguments in favour of the Bretton Woods institutions. So the IMF and the World Bank were set up at the end of World War II, partly in response to the idea that unregulated capitalism had been one of the main causes of World War II, and therefore there was this collective desire to have international institutions to manage and regulate the global economy much better after World War II. And then secondly, another argument in favour of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank is, in theory, these institutions give poorer countries lots of funding and also lots of expertise that should in theory help them with their economic development and with the reduction of poverty. However, as you're probably aware, these institutions are incredibly controversial. And the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO are often the focus of a lot of political protest. And I think the main reason that the Bretton Woods institutions attract so much criticism is the perception that they're not really neutral development agencies, but instead they reflect the interests of the most powerful countries, the richest countries in the world. And this means that in the eyes of many people in developing countries, the Bretton Woods institutions are seen to promote a pro-Western, particularly pro-American agenda. And therefore these institutions lack legitimacy in the eyes of many people in developing countries. For example, the head of the IMF has always been a European. So up until a couple of years ago, the head of the IMF was a Frenchman called Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who had to resign from the IMF after he allegedly sexually assaulted a maid in a New York hotel room. But his successor, Christine Lagarde, is also French, so it's another European in charge of the IMF. And then ever since its inception, the head of the World Bank has always been the nominee of the American president. So they selected a new head of the World Bank last year, and the nominee and the person who got the job was Kim Yong-jim, who was the person that Barack Obama wanted, even though many people in developing countries actually preferred this candidate from Nigeria. Since the 1980s, the Bretton Woods institutions have been heavily influenced by neoliberalism, and this has made these institutions very unpopular with people on the left of politics, with many of those critics arguing that the types of policies pursued by the IMF and the World Bank, the structural adjustment programs, have not actually been that successful. And interestingly, protests against the IMF have now spread to Europe, particularly in a country like Greece, which is being bailed out by the IMF at the moment. And just as the IMF has imposed strict conditions on the loans that it's given to poorer countries, there are strict conditions being imposed on Greece at the moment, and we're seeing a lot of political protest against those conditions. So in this screencast, we define transnational organisations. So we're talking about international organisations that have a remit that go beyond a particular country. We've looked at the main types of transnational organisations, both ones that involve governments and also NGOs, and then we focused our attention on the Bretton Woods institutions. And in the second screencast, we're going to focus particularly on the role of transnational corporations.